Hey guys, welcome to the I Hope They Hear This podcast. And we have a returning guest. This is kind of crazy to say, but you were with us over a year ago. I was looking it up,
Yes.
and this is episode 73, but you were on episode 11, so very early on.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for those of you who don't know, this is we have Pastor John Kim on. I've known him for a very long time. He's a very good friend, a very good hung, and he is my pastor at my church. So I'm super excited to have you on with us today. Thank you for coming.
Hey, David. Always honored. Honored to be back with the I Hope They Hear This family and all the listeners out there. Of course, sharing time with you and having conversations. This is what we do all the time. So
Yes.
I'm happy and glad and excited to be back on. Thanks for
Yeah.
welcoming me back.
Yeah. So for the listeners who have been listening to the most recent episodes, one of the things that I've been doing, yeah, I guess it's kind of focused on a single topic for now, but
Mm,
we've just been talking a lot about kind of the incidences that have been happening. I talked to Ginny before we even knew the whole Ahmaud Arbery thing happened. I talked to
hmm
Jessica specifically about that incident, and we weren't planning on talking about this. Well, at least I wasn't, because I wasn't aware this happened. But I think before the whole George Floyd thing was, publicized and went viral, we I said I wanted to continue having this conversation. So it's
Yeah.
unfortunate, but we just have another thing to talk about today. And the thing I wanted to talk specifically about with you, Pastor John, is
hmm
um, the Asian American. I guess I say Asian American, but I'm gonna go specific today. I want to talk about the Korean American churches kind of response to what's kind of been happening, and
Yeah.
what does it look like? Is it adequate? Is it not adequate? What could it look like? All those kind of things. So
Yeah.
yeah, the first question I wanted to ask you, Pastor John, is the George Floyd thing is very recent, so I don't know how
Right.
much we can speak on that. But at least with the incident with Ahmaud Arbery, what do you feel
Yeah.
like the Korean American church's response has been?
Yeah, so I in my church we get the Korean church newspaper, the Christian Times, and so I pick it up, kind of look through the headlines, things like that. But also with our church has a staff that's like a little bit over a dozen people, so just monitoring conversations. Of course, with COVID-19, we haven't had the kind of normal interaction with church members, so it's hard to get a gauge of like individuals or pockets of groups and what they're talking about. But I would say there is a wide spectrum of the response, but the bulk of the response, honestly, is a lot of silence. A lot of silence in the sense of this doesn't have to do with us. This is America's problem. If you talk to a lot of first generation immigrants, when they look at social issues in America, they don't think it's their problem. They don't think it's related to them. And so I think a lot of the response is no response. A lot of the response is just silence in the whole matter, and in not even being informed on what's happening most of the time.
Mm,
So I think that's one end of it, and it's hard for me to put a number or percentage on how much or how many people fall in that category,
mm,
but I would say the bulk of it is along those lines. Then the other side is not just the first generation Korean Americans, but second and third generation, and on that side, I would say more of the millennials and younger generation. I think there is more of an outcry,
mm,
and then the outcry is kind of spread out in different categories as well. There's the outcry of let's focus on the perpetrators, the ones who are the suspects, like in the Ahmaud Arbery case, the McMichaels,
mm,
right? Those the father and son, and then there's the other side that says justice through them is not enough. There's a systemic oppression going on, and so let's outcry on behalf of the African American community, and it gets into a much more diverse political kind of conversation there, and people take strong opinions about it. You know, I'm not a stranger to social media, so I've seen other pastors, other church leaders, other people in the church put out their personal feelings and opinions about it on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of those places. And there's some really strong opinions crying out against some of these things.
Mm. And one interesting thing that I recently thought about is, you know how you were talking about, there's like a demarcation of responses, right? And the line is kind of the generational line. The first
Yeah,
generation being, and optically, again, like we can't speak on the actual numbers or the percentage, but at least from our
right.
optics, it looks like they're mostly just being silent and kind of sticking to themselves. But like you were saying, the millennials uh, and beyond or younger are being more
Yeah,
vocal about it. And do you think so? Because one thing that's kind of changed from, let's say, like 10, 15 years ago is the fact that
yeah,
a lot of the millennials are actually in, pastoral and leadership positions within the churches.
right.
Might not be like head pastor, but like you yourself, you are the youth and the English ministry pastor at our church, and a lot of your
Yeah,
peers are, English ministry pastors at their churches. So do
right.
you feel like, because of there's a difference in the type of response we're giving now in kind of this generation because our leaders are, second or third generation like ourselves?
I would start my answer to that question by saying we always want informed leaders. And I would hope we want more thoughtful, well cultured, plugged in leaders. And that's what we want. I mean, you're right. I mean, a lot of my peers and what I would call in the Korean language, 선배들, my seniors, people who have been in the pastoral ministry, who are in their 50s and 40s, truly a 1.5 or second generation. They're much more well versed in these kinds of situations, current events, and news. And from them, yes, there is a more thoughtful response. But as I'm saying that, I hope that more and more leaders would carefully consider their response before just, like reactively putting it out there on social media, and just really think about, how can someone who might not be so well versed or not be so thoughtful as you are take your comments and then say, hey, my leader is saying this, so let's take it to the next step or the next level, and let's let my response out there be uh, pushed up a notch. So one of the things that I really want to say is, it's good, I think, in my opinion, it's good to be angry at murder, hatred, and violence. But you have to be wise in how you craft those words and how you put it out there, because then other people who are less well versed or less thoughtful can take that response and say, let's perpetrate and expand and amplify the angry, righteous response that my pastor has and take it to the next level. And it causes like this idea of like mass hysteria that expands to exponential proportions as it goes out from the influencer. The influencer themselves might have an opinion that's kind of within the boundaries of a very thoughtful, thought provoking, well thought out kind of stance. But other people might take that and expand it to something that it shouldn't be, and take it to different levels that can then go on to what we might say is irresponsible, or in a lot of senses maybe detrimental to the entirety of the conversation that we're trying to have rather than be helpful.
Do you feel like that's a newer issue that we're having? Because previously our leaders were our parents, right? And the
Right.
first generation, they've mostly been kind of silent about these issues. But now that we have,
Mm.
leaders that are like second generation, do you feel like we're going to start having issues where, like you were saying, there's an amplification of righteous anger and like a distortion into violent, unproductive anger?
I mean, I think it's with human kind of society and the way that we work. um yeah, it's like the game of telephone. The message will always be passed on, It's just a matter of what message gets passed on,
Mm,
and it's just a matter of understanding like that's gonna it's gonna happen. I think to your question, yes. Frankly, I think it will continue to happen that way. But I would also say um, it's not a new phenomenon. Honestly, with a lot of first generation Koreans that I've seen in the church, like for instance, if the senior pastor has a stance of saying, uh, a lot of times they'll lead prayer, and something will come out like, let's pray against that North Korean leader
mm,
and let's pray for his demise. Then the congregation just kind of takes on that from their leader, and they'll hold that to heart. But if the leader, the senior pastor, begins to pray like, hey, let us pray for wisdom and peace and unity to be brought back to the Korean Peninsula. Let's pray for the political leaders of the North and the South that they would come to agreement. Then the congregation takes that on
mm,
and makes that their kind of core belief of what they see. So a unification versus non-unification kind of conversation within the Korean American church, especially the immigrant Korean church, has been happening for a very long time. And then the way that people get swayed is that, hey, their senior pastor kind of puts their opinion out there,
mm,
and they just kind of take it on for themselves. So this phenomenon, I don't think is a new thing, especially in cultural issues within the church. Um, yeah, it's been happening for a long time, and it's only going to continue.
mm. Do you feel like it's a beneficial thing that leaders are being more vocal in our like Korean American church community, or do you feel like it's a more detrimental thing? Because the
You know,
silence might just kind of keep everyone in the status quo, but a vocal leader, there's potential for something going, a message being distorted, throughout the
yeah,
grapevine, and you know inciting some sort of violence or something, right?
yeah. There's always that keyword, use wisdom,
Mm,
be thoughtful, be discerning about what you say or what you don't say. Um, Leaders cannot, and this goes for not just church leaders, but leaders of any organization.
mm,
Um, it could be whether you are, leading a company, a nonprofit. It could even be where you have a small business and you're leading your employees. It could even be that you're the husband and father of a household. What you say and what you don't say is going to matter. And so, we always have to find ourselves in a fine balance between, like, let's say for instance, if we don't say anything, then our silence seems to be a message that we're condoning things and letting things go, that we're not, like for instance, in the case of a husband and father, if a child is misbehaving and you don't say anything, then your child's misbehaviors are only going to continue, they're not going to stop.
mhm,
All right, and then but then the other way, we can't just be dictators and control all the ideas and all the philosophies and all the ways of thinking of our people either. A father cannot just force their children to just do as just they say without any personal freedom given to that child as well. So that would be an abuse of power that we do not want to have. And even for pastors or leaders of any organization, you don't want to become that kind of dictator. So we can't be totally passive. We can't be totally authoritative. It's got to be a fine balance. So to young leaders, and I hope to hear this one day at a pastors conference. Maybe hope to speak about it one day at a pastors conference. But you really have to be wise and pick and choose certain topics that you do speak out about. And of course, for each their own, they're going to be passionate about certain things versus others. Some people are going to get passionate about immigration, let's say. Some
mm,
people are going to be passionate about topics like Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, about perceived kind of systemic oppression and racism, things like that. And other people are going to be passionate about slavery that's happening today. All the things that we're dealing with right now this week with George Floyd and all that stuff. The social justice warriors out there will say, this is all a product of the American slavery system that we've had. It's been abolished for 150 years, but we haven't made any progress. And yet we're not talking about slavery that's still happening today sometimes.
Right.
So I mean, people get passionate about different topics here and there, and so my stance would be just you have to be wise and pick and choose where you speak and where you don't. And if you do speak, I think the greatest choice that you can make is whether you speak about it privately or speak about it publicly. Whether you want to just throw a blanket statement and throw your opinion out there on social media, or you gather with your people face to face, or actually right now we can't do face to face, but you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
gather with your people face to face and have open, honest conversations like this. Or you meet with people one on one and find out where people stand on certain things, and then talk through it that way. I think really the greatest choice, the wisest choice that a leader has to make all the time is whether you're going to do it publicly or privately, whether you're going to do it from a passenger seat in a car, or you're going to do it from a pulpit, or you're going to do it from your Instagram account. Like, you know, that those are the kinds of decisions that you have to make as a leader, because your words are going to carry weight,
Yeah.
and it's going to influence people and sway people sometimes. And because, to be honest, people get passionate about things, but to be honest, most people are very apathetic about most things.
Mm.
So if they hear an opinion of a person that they trust, especially a church leader, someone in pastoral ministry, without even thinking twice about it, they might take that opinion as their own. So you got to kind of, yeah, it's a multi-layered kind of thought process that needs to happen before you decide to do anything.
Yeah.
Hopefully, your people that you lead are more thoughtful and well versed on things that are happening in the world. But if they're not, part of your job might be that you need to educate them and inform them about things that are happening, um, and then have thoughtful conversations afterwards. And hopefully, they're doing it all through. This is my last point, but
Mm-hmm.
hopefully, they're doing it all through the lens of faith in Jesus Christ first and foremost. Because we're talking right here today with you. I'm talking today about a church response, right? So it needs to be through the lens of faith. Like, what does our faith say? What does our Lord Jesus say about oppression and oppressors, and how to deal with them, and how to approach them, how to deal with your enemies, even people who have maybe been violent against you, angry against you, who have really brought you down, and their sole cause in life is to destroy you. What does Jesus say about that? And as spiritual leaders, as pastoral leaders, be talking more about those kinds of things rather than the actual political nature of things. I think that would be a good way to kind of go about it as young or middle age or millennial or second, third generation pastoral leaders.
Mm. That's actually really eye-opening, because I think it's a very good point that leaders need to be much more wise and careful with the words, especially knowing that taken out of context, it can have detrimental effects, and it can be counterproductive to the message that they're trying to spread, right? So
Yeah.
if I'm being really frank, I have felt in you know, not specifically with these most recent incidences, but in the past, I felt that sometimes the church leaders of the Korean American church were kind of delayed in their response. And
Hmm.
I thought that that delay was detrimental to actually doing something positive, standing for justice. But now
Hmm.
knowing how much rides on how they word things and the things they choose to say, it actually makes sense that they take their time, because obviously they probably need to pray about it, go into scripture and try to really formulate a wise response, right? It's not just a off the cuff, um, just reaction, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it would be irresponsible. I know that's a harsh word, but it would be irresponsible to just throw out off the cuff, like, comments and thoughts. Um, yeah, I mean, we live in a Twitter verse world, and Twitter is that, right? It's just you just put your immediate thoughts out there.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
it's another podcast for another day. But that is just so dangerous. You're playing with fire.
Hmm.
As
So
James tells us, in the scriptures, the tongue can be fire. It,
yeah,
it can really destroy and kill. So right now in our world, our tongues look like fingers, and they're on keyboards. And you're putting your words out there, but you really need to be thoughtful before you put it out there.
yeah. James chapter 3 verse 1. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. So and you kind of alluded to when these things happen, church leaders
Yeah,
need to be talking more about kind of Jesus's response, right? What would Jesus have said about these things?
yeah,
Do you have any thought yet? I mean, if you don't have any thought yet,
yeah.
in light of what we talked about, please, feel free to say no. I decline to
No,
comment.
no.
Take your time. But do you have any response to what's been happening with like George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery? Like, what do you feel like Jesus's response
Yeah.
to these things would have been?
Um, yeah, man, that makes it so weighty again to
Yeah.
say that this is what Jesus would say. No, let me just go from just what I have kind of understood and lived in life.
Mm,
I just preface it by saying, like, um, in a good and bad way, in my personal story, in my personal life, I am not a stranger to violence. I have experienced moments, a moment where I saw my own father get beat senseless in front of my eyes on the streets where we used to live. I remember crying in my mother's arms, watching him get beat by three men late at night near our home. I remember crying in her chest as we rode the ambulance to the hospital. So that I remember the terror in my mom's eyes when I was a little bit older, her telling me another story where my father again got kidnapped at knife point and driven around the city by like a madman, like just demanding
wow.
him to drive. So I've seen that in ministry. I've held the hands of a mother who lost a young college son to gun violence. I've stood by that family during the funeral and just their grieving process and their mourning process, and kind of going through what they had to go through in that moment. So, all these instances kind of shape my view on how I see these things. And so, all that to say, first and foremost, I know, David, you and I were talking more about Ahmaud Arbery first. But I would say, first and foremost, there is no condoning hunting people down, whether you think they have committed a burglary or not, whether you think they've committed a crime or not. I mean, I understand the whole community police watch and like citizens arrest and things like that. We want citizens to stand up for what is right. We want people to be able to kind of protect each other and not just protect their own. But there is no condoning like hunting someone down in the middle of the street while they're on a jog. If you suspect something of them, then they should just call the authorities. They should, take the proper steps, not load themselves with a gun and then go hunt them down as if, they're going on a deer hunt or something.
Right.
So that, all that to say, I think that's what needs to happen. So proper justice being served is what I would want to see. And I think in the state of Georgia, for some of your listeners who might not be from the state of Georgia, last week, the Attorney General of Georgia appointed a prosecutor from Cobb County, which is over, I think, about 250, almost 300 miles away from the District of Brunswick. And so the state of Georgia is trying to do its part. And the the prosecutor, from Cobb County that was appointed to the case, she is an African American woman,
Mm,
and her name is I think Joyette Holmes, was appointed to look over the McMichael father and son case. And so I think the proper steps are being taken to conduct justice and bring about what we can do as a civilized society to bring justice to a hateful, violent murder. Let's just call it what it is. It's
yeah.
murder.
Yeah.
Um, And I think that's what needs to be done. Let's bring justice. Let's bring the people who committed this crime to justice.
Mm.
Um, for the George Floyd case, I know it's so fresh, so raw. We're recording this on, sorry to give it away, on a
That's fine.
Thursday,
Yeah.
and it happened just a few days ago. So we have to kind of let it unfold and play out. But I know the mayor of Minneapolis already fired the 4 police officers, and the one who actually held George Floyd down, the mayor was talking about bringing criminal charges against him. And so if that's what needs to be done, that's what needs to be done. Like,
Yeah.
if there is a hateful murder that happens, the price needs to be paid.
Mm.
Um, so let's bring them to justice.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would be my response to these situations, and keep it kind of right there. Let's take the victim, let's take the suspects, prosecute them to the best of our ability that our country can, and bring them to justice.
Mm.
Present the evidence for what it is.
Yeah. And for sure, you said this. We were texting about this earlier, but also stand by the victims, and like mourn with them, and
Of
yeah.
course.
Mm. So
Yeah, I mean, those families, you got to feel for them.
for sure. So with what we so with all that said, in the future, hopefully, you know, we pray that nothing like this happens again. But in the
Yeah.
case that there is, how do you think the Korean American Church should respond? Like, what do you think the unified response of the Korean American Church should be to something like this that happens again in the future?
Yeah, I think it's yes, it's our neighbors. Our African American brothers and sisters are our neighbors, and for Ahmad's family, their plight is not something that we should ignore. It's not something that we should just dismiss. It should be something that we unify around, and really care for. But I'm trying to be thoughtful in what I say right now
Yeah.
because it's gonna get dicey. But you know, we haven't had a very racially tense, or I mean, not since LA in 91, 92, but we haven't had a situation where an Asian American or a Korean American was kind of put in a situation similar to Ahmad's. And so we're not going to understand exactly apples to apples what it feels like and what they're going through. And I know part of the response right now with all the anger and all the kind of protests and the rioting and things that are going on is that there's this idea that African Americans in general, as a whole, are being systematically um, discriminated against, racially profiled. That there are racist people out there. The white majority is doing everything they can to keep down and oppress Black people in the community. And so Korean Americans don't understand that well. But if ever a situation like that happened, we need to be very thoughtful and think about what the African American community, or I don't want to generalize, but let's just say Ahmaud Arbery's family is going through, so that one day, if ever, hopefully it never happens, a Korean American young man were to be killed in kind of a hateful, racially profiled kind of way, then we would have a sober yet thoughtful response that seeks justice solely for the perpetrators, rather than kind of putting out this megaphone of America's hating Asian people worldwide, or
Mm.
or across the board kind of thing. um, so that we don't have a kind of hysterical response that's along the lines of something like this.
Mm.
I really want to say it's a matter of personal responsibility that we need to be thinking about. I pray that we would take moments like this to reflect on, not only with the African American community, not only with the majority white Caucasian Anglo American community, but with Hispanic, Latino communities, with other groups within the Asian kind of spectrum as well. Like there's always tensions between Asians as well. Like
Yeah.
that we would think about like how can we be peacemakers rather than people who are perpetuating the tension and the anger between groups of people senselessly.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a kind of a long-winded way to say, I think Korean Americans, first of all, you just need to be informed. You need to be thoughtful, be sensitive, and consider what would happen if that was your son. How would you feel if it was your son or your husband or your grandson? And then go through that, go through faith, through Jesus Christ, and see what you would want to do. How would you want to be comforted? How would you want to receive blessing and love and comfort from other people? Yeah.
Mm. So, yeah, I think the key there is, especially for maybe our parents' generation, to be informed, right? You can't really speak on anything if you don't know what's happening. And, I think that's been one of the criticisms that I've been seeing on. So, I will say this. I have been seeing a lot more discussion about the Asian American voice, like
Hmm.
this time around, way more than in the past. And one of the self criticisms that I see of Asian Americans giving our, criticizing the Asian American community for is that we tend to kind of silo ourselves in this country and care only about what's happening to us and not really paying attention to what's happening outside of our communities.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you were saying, to be loving neighbors, because the other minorities, even white America, right, is our neighbor. So in order to be loving neighbors like we're commanded to do, we need to be informed about what's happening, to extend a helping hand when needed, right? So
Yeah.
yeah. So
No,
what
definitely. Hmm.
Mhm. Another question that another thing I wanted to bring up is I totally understand the kind of angry, like the righteous anger, kind of the how do I put this correct? I'm being very careful about how I put this too. But
Mm.
the I understand the anger that people are expressing, right? It's very sad,
Hmm.
I would be very upset and angry if someone that I knew was in that position, like George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery, and killed like senselessly. But one thing that I have been seeing is in that outburst of anger, people have been trying to focus that anger at a target. And
Hmm.
instead of keeping that target as the suspects, like you were talking about, I've been seeing it kind of having a splash effect, right? So the first time around with Ahmaud Arbery, one criticism that I had for kind of the mainstream news media was that they were very adamant and very
Hmm.
specific in pointing out the fact that the shooter, the father, the McMichael's father, was ex cop, and that he
Hmm.
was a white supremacist, right? So it kind of in
Mm.
that moment, I felt like there was a target being painted on like policemen and white people. And
Yeah.
again with this scenario, with George Floyd, I mean it's a cop that committed the murder, but there's everyone's very they're very purposefully pointing out, oh, the other cop that was kind of watching was an Asian American, right? So
Yeah.
they're I feel like that's like I feel like it's very dangerous,
Yeah.
to because like we both you and I, we personally have friends who are police officers,
Yeah.
and they're very good people. They don't break the rules. They're not corrupt in any sense of the word. But now there's like our friend, he actually sent me a photo today of him having to wear extra body protect like body armor because of the protests that are happening in
Right.
Minneapolis. So
Right.
what are am I do you feel like I'm correct in thinking that that's dangerous to do, or is that an okay response from the people to say things like, oh, the police officers are bad, or like these Caucasian people, they're inherently bad?
I mean, my response again would be personal responsibility is where we need to be focused on.
Mhm.
As you were saying, the suspects, the perpetrators, we need to be focused on them. To paint generalizations and broaden it to a scope, um, it's that exercise is self-defeating. It really is self-defeating. Like, for instance, like, you may think that in America, the white majority oppresses all the minorities. But in smaller sections, when you take a closer look, like, there are always going to be subsets of people who are the majority versus the minority. Like, what we should, as believers, whether it's Asian American or any Christian, you should be thinking about how when people who are in a supposed majority take their authority in that stance and then use that to dominate and really oppress other people. That's what we should be angry about. And that's what we should be righteously angry about, not this like broad sweeping generalization of things. For instance, like, if you go in certain communities, the white population is not the majority. Maybe, like, let's say the Asian population is a majority. Like, let's say Chinatown in like New York City or LA somewhere or San Francisco. Like, the majority population is going to be Chinese. It's going to be Asian. And in those communities, how do Asians as a majority, how do they serve? How do they deal with? How do they interact with people of different ethnic groups? Because in a situation like that, I mean, where the majority is not white, they could be oppressors easily as well.
Mm.
And so going back, I know the conversation that we're trying to have is kind of a white black conversation. But you go to some cities, some areas, there might be a black majority. And in that area, let's say a neighborhood that's a 10 by 10 radius, okay? Like 10 blocks by 10 blocks.
Mhm.
In a 10 by 10 block where, let's say, the African American population is the majority, how are they treating others of a different ethnic group, a different race? And are they being fair? Are they being kind, or are they being oppressive? Are they being demeaning? Are they being racist against white people, black people, Asian people, or Latino people? You know, uh, so if you take the conversation to this group versus this group, that conversation is going to be self-defeating, because right now the conversation that people want to have, especially in mainstream media, is white people are the majority and they're oppressing black people.
Mm.
So black people across the board are all victims. Okay, but go into a black neighborhood where a white kid is struggling to survive and make it. So then in that situation, can you not call the white kid a victim of racism? Like, that the whole conversation, when you group people together, it's self-defeating.
Yeah.
And I know, I mean, I've listened to political commentary. I try to be thoughtful and listen to both sides of the conversation. To be honest, I'm just putting it out there. I consider myself to be really moderate. So I like listening to both the liberal, progressive, and conservative kind of talk.
Mhm.
And a lot of the progressive liberal talk, they always talk about, well, you can't use that example of how black people can't be victims in America because no other group in America has gone through slavery like us. And
Mhm.
because you're not the descendants of slaves in this country, um, you don't get to, because if you're not black, then you don't get to have an opinion or a say in what we're going through. You don't know what we're going through. And to that, I would say, number one, if just because you're a black, you're being discriminated against, I would stand on your side 10 out of 10 times and say, that's wrong.
Mhm.
That's wrong. But then to live inside a victim mentality, like, you don't know what I go through and you can't ever feel what I feel, I would say no. Because historically, like, let's just put it out there, everyone across the whole world has been a slave of someone at some point in history.
Mhm.
Okay, at some point in history, if you're of European descent, you were a slave of Romans, Greeks, maybe Egyptians, even, and maybe even the Persians and the Ottoman Empire. If you're from Far East, you have been a slave. Your descendants were a slave of the Mongols, or the Chinese, or the Japanese at some point in your history.
Mhm.
Like, and then the African countries, they're still in that phase where there's a lot of infighting and civil war and all this stuff. So like the level of oppression is, everyone has had it across the board. Like every racial group has been oppressed by another race sometime or another through history. So to say because you're not black in America, you don't get to have an opinion about it, I think we can throw that out.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense. It really doesn't make sense. Let's talk about here and now. Let's talk about, once again, the suspects themselves, and let's talk about bringing them to justice rather than creating this big idea of what it is or it isn't. Um, you know, it's hard to have this conversation without people getting mad. I understand.
Mhm.
It's a very touchy, emotional subject for a lot of people. But if we were to all agree, let's just see people as people,
Yeah.
color blindedly, and even as I say that, I know a lot of people on the progressive left would say that's an offensive comment. Like, you offend me by taking away my rights as a Asian American, as a Latino American, or even African American. But how can we, not all African American people think the same way, just
Mhm.
as not all Asian American people think the same way. So how can we group groups together and pin them against other groups when we, even within ourselves, don't all think the same way?
Mhm.
Like, it just doesn't make sense to me that we would go down that path of thinking that way.
Yeah.
Um,
I think I totally agree with that. And that's why I think kind of this comparative suffering is ridiculous. When people say, you haven't gone through the level of suffering I have, like, so that nullifies your suffering. I think that's weird because suffering is supposed to be personal to everybody, right? Like, for
yeah,
me, suffering might be I'm not able to pay the bills. But for my daughter, is suffering is I'm not able to reach, the piece of cake on the floor that I
that I
want to
really
get.
want.
Yeah, right. Like, because my suffering is, in my perspective, greater, that doesn't nullify the fact that she's suffering, right? So I
Yeah.
totally agree with what you're saying, and I actually even take it a step further. I don't. This is going to be really controversial, and my wife always warns me against saying controversial things on this podcast. So
Yeah.
sorry, Shirley, but I I think it's bad. I don't think it's a good idea when people apologize for their race. Like, um, something I've been seeing a lot is Caucasian people trying to be allies and support the Black community. They keep saying, "I'm so sorry for my race. I'm so sorry for my race." And I've
Yeah.
seen Asian Americans do that too, condemning what Officer Tao, is that his name?
Yeah. There's Tao.
Yeah, he was just standing by as George Floyd was basically being murdered. I see a lot of Asian
Right.
Americans saying, I apologize for my Asian brother or whatever. Like, I apologize on his behalf," because an apology, I think, implies responsibility. I'm not responsible for what
Mm.
Officer Tao did. Um, Other white people, they're not responsible for. Is it the McMichaels?
Yeah, the McMichaels.
Yeah, other, like, my Caucasian neighbor, they had nothing to do with what the McMichaels did. And in
Yeah.
the same way, racists who think like Black people are bad because they had some sort of experience, like, you
Mm.
can't transfer an experience that you had with someone onto someone else simply because they had the same skin color, right? So I
Right.
think it's I think it's self-defeating. I think it's counter to what we're trying to do. We're trying to say you can't generalize based on race, and that's what we're fighting against, right? So much of the systemic racism injustices we're talking about is based on the fact that there's a higher, like, the white oppressive class is suppressing Black people simply because they're Black, right? So in that
Mm.
same vein, I don't I definitely I would not have done what Officer Tao did. So I'm not going to take responsibility for that, and therefore I'm not going to apologize for that. He has nothing to do with me. And so when those apologies happen, I think it's weird. Like, I personally think it's not good. I don't want to perpetuate this um, somehow because we're one race, we're responsible for what everyone else does, because that arms the racists even more. If a racist
Yeah.
was robbed by a black guy, then they have all the, like, in that mentality, they have every reason to go on hating black people, right?
Hmm.
So in order to fight against that, I don't. So I would say that let's not apologize for people just because you have a common skin color as them. I think you can feel bad. I think you can extend condolences and say,
Hmm.
we're mourning with you. But if you're not related to the situation, then you have nothing to apologize for.
Hmm.
Is that too harsh to say?
You know, to be sensitive and careful of my words too, again, if if you are a person who buys into the conversation of groups versus groups, one group discriminating against the other, then what you just said is going to be offensive to them. But
Mm,
if you don't subscribe to that way of thinking, then what you said just makes total sense. To go back to my story again that I prefaced earlier, at 3.5, 4 years old, I saw my father get beat senseless in front of me on a street by three African American men.
mm,
They were African American. Now, I'm not going to go up to all my African American friends and be like, hey, apologize on behalf of your people to me, because that was a traumatic event for me. And that was a real crime. That assault had tremendous effects on my development as a young person in America. I mean, I'm not going to do that. That, to me, that sounds ludicrous. Like,
yeah,
it sounds ridiculous. Like, I have neighbors to my left who are African American. I'm not gonna walk up to their door and be like, apologize on behalf of your people. Like, and so much in the same way, as you're saying, I agree with you that I'm not gonna be sitting here apologizing for somebody else's actions. Now, if somebody has a gripe against me personally, those are the things I will take personal responsibility for, and I will apologize if that needs to happen. If that's a situation. You know, I'm not trying to turn the conversation, but a lot of Korean Americans own businesses. Like, if you go to a Koreatown, things like that, where a lot of the workers and things like that are of different race, whether they're Black, Latino, Hispanic, doesn't matter. And there have been a lot of stories where Korean Americans take advantage of people of different minority races. Um, but I wasn't one of them. I didn't do that. I'm not
mm,
gonna apologize on behalf of, so and so business owner who treated so and so employee very, very badly, or underpaid them, and did some shady things with, anyway, that's another story for another day.
yeah,
But I'm not going to apologize on their behalf. That's their personal actions that they need to take personal responsibility for.
yeah,
you know Much to say that too is like, in the scope of all these things, to keep broader historical perspective sometimes would, I think, help the conversation. um and to not make this like a all of a sudden 90-degree turn into a spiritual realm. But Christians in the early church face a lot of oppression and discrimination from the Roman government. um like, there was an incident in Rome where a couple of emperors, Claudius and Nero. Claudius wasn't as mean as Nero, but Claudius just kicked all the Jews and Christians out of Rome. And so we find out a lot of one of the people that we're actually going to talk about this week is Priscilla and Aquila. They were thrown out of Rome. They were sent out of Rome from where they grew up and where they were living, um, because of this kind of racial discrimination. But in that moment, God had a plan for them, and God used that kind of oppression uh, for their good. Because along the way, they met this guy named Paul, who was on fire for Jesus and started planting churches wherever he went. Priscilla and Aquila just happened to be in the same trade. They had the same skill as Paul, and became partners with Paul, and they became critical key figures in the growth of the church. Um, to back it up to Roman history again with the Christians, Nero came along and there was a great fire in Rome, and a lot of historians believe that he set the fire to kind of take control of the city, but a lot of the blame came on him. So he shifted the blame by putting it on these weird Christians, these people who worship a guy who died on a cross, but supposedly came back to life. So he blamed Christians. So he would round up the Christians. He would burn some at a stake. He would behead a lot of them, put their heads on the stake, and use their heads, light their heads on fire as lights along the path. He would throw a lot of Christians into animal like dens and be torn apart by beasts. And so they faced tremendous discrimination that is like by far on a greater scale than what we see in modern day. I mean, thankfully, society has progressed since that time.
Yeah.
And I mean, even in our oppression of one another, it's been, I'm not belittling the oppression that people are experiencing today, but it's not like you're being fed to the wolves or the lions, things like that. But all that, I'm saying all this to say, scripture from the Bible would tell us, even in the face of all that persecution, the Christians, they held on to their faith, and their response was to honor the emperor, which is crazy, right? I'm just going to read one thing here.
Yeah.
In the book of First Peter, the Apostle Peter tells us in verse 13 through 18. He says, "Be subject to the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to the governors as sent by him, to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover up for evil, but living as servants of God." In verse 17 of 1 Peter 2, he says, "Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor." I mean, like, for him to say that when his fellow brothers in Rome are being persecuted on that kind of level,
Yeah.
it shows you that our response doesn't have to go to this very uh, carnal, very reactive response of saying it's this group against that group and this against that. Like, let's be sensible. Let's, under the Lord, understand that God is sovereign. He's in control. Ultimately, the victory is going to be found with those who stand with Christ. So let's not overstep our bounds in our righteous anger and push it that far. Let's take the sober-minded approach of things and say, for those who are perpetrators of hate and violence, yes, you will be called to justice. But to paint broader pictures and cast bigger kind of initiatives into realms that you shouldn't be going into, let's not take that step.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of just I know we talked about a lot of different kind of aspects of this, but if I were to boil it down, what I think we're saying is the response, um, and again we'll keep it specific. The response of the Korean American Church should be,
Yeah,
yeah, very specific to the perpetrators. I mean, if there is like systemically something wrong, so one thing I talked about with my police officer friend is I asked him,
mm-hmm.
is it protocol to have your knee on the neck of a guy who's on the floor like that? And he said absolutely not. I mean,
Not.
if if he's fighting, you can do that to subdue them, but once they're in cuffs, like there's no reason to do that. And he said he like royally screwed up. He should not have been doing that. So, but if the protocol was you can keep your knee on someone's neck for as long as you want to, then I think we target our righteous anger to that protocol, that systemic issue there. Um, but to without really knowing, saying all police officers are corrupt or all white people are out to oppress the minorities, I think that's counterproductive. And so, like the response should be specific to the perpetrators of the hate and evil, and
Yeah,
and on the other side of that, we should, because we talked about this a lot too. We should um, seek to console and to stand with the people who are feeling lost and who are mourning deaths of sons, daughters, brothers, fathers. Um, but one thing I learned with talking with you today is I tend to be kind of a impatient guy sometimes. Internally, I
Hmm.
don't always show it, but like I want things to like happen and move. And so sometimes I see these things happen, and when I see a delay in the response of like some of the church leaders, I start getting antsy. Like, why aren't they saying anything? But after talking to you today, Pastor John, I now understand and see that the time to like really sit and think about and formulate a like seeking wisdom and formulating a wise response is important. Like that gives me new perspective and makes me and helps me to understand, oh, that's why sometimes there's a delay, and I should
Hmm.
not be upset about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's like I was saying, leaders are in many, many forms. It comes in different shapes and sizes. The church is not just the only institution that Asian Americans or Korean Americans follow.
Hmm.
There are business leaders, there are community leaders, there are, like yourself, husbands and fathers, and all these people are put in positions of leadership. And so their leadership carries weight and influence. And to misuse or abuse that leadership, I think would be the yeah, it would be the saddest part of anything like this. So you just have to be wise. You have to be thoughtful. You have to be careful, because your words are going to carry weight more than just being an individual. You're speaking to people who are looking to you to try to follow your lead on things. So be thoughtful, be careful, and I would just put it out there. Um, I believe that everyone is a leader. I believe that everyone leads other people. Whether you're, you know, within a group of friends, you're maybe you have a group of friends that you're very close with. Your opinion matters to them. So what you say matters, and what you think matters. And so even within social groups, social circles, these kinds of things need to be thought out before spoken of. It's good to have friends that you can be completely honest with, to throw ideas back and forth, to hone your perspective and kind of narrow down what it is that I truly believe or don't believe. So I would advise and recommend that people have those kinds of exercises where you approach your closest friends and say, "Hey, I'm feeling this way about George Floyd this week, but I don't know if it's right. Before I sit here and argue my case and be stubborn and selfish and say, this is the way that people should think, this is the way that you should think about it, let's just have the approach of humility and say, I'm having these thoughts. I just want to run it by you guys because you're my trusted, close group of friends, or you're my family. And let's have a conversation about it. Let's see if we can inform each other about some of these things before I just go to Twitter and put it out there."
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Um, and so just be thoughtful, because it is a sensitive issue. There's lives that were lost, and there's lives that will be changed forever. Crime in this country is a real thing,
Yeah.
and unfortunately, a disproportionate amount of crime is kind of experienced within the African American community. Um, that is just true. Like, you can check the FBI facts. Like, a lot of homicides, armed robberies, burglaries, assaults happen within the African American community. Now, whether it was done by other groups towards African Americans or from African Americans to other African Americans, that's beside the point. But it's a sensitive topic because there's lives that will be forever changed. So for all of us, especially Korean American Church, we need to have a thoughtful conversation, be informed. Let us truly talk about it with one another, and then put out a response that is glorifying to God and brings justice and healing and comfort to those who are mourning.
For sure. And I think we do need to realize the power in the things that we say, because the Ahmaud Arbery case, that happened in what, like February? But
Yeah, it happened in February, and then the story didn't pop until like what, a couple of weeks ago.
yeah, and it wasn't until a national outcry that the persecutors were assigned and all these kind of things happened, right? So there is
Hmm.
power in, the people, like in what we say. But if we
Right.
wield that power negatively, then it can have negative effects. So I'm not saying that this is the case, but let's, for instance, say, Officer Tao, he did nothing wrong. He was following protocol as it was explained to him, and he did everything that he should have done. Like, that man's life is ruined now. He's been fired. I don't know. He's probably not going to be charged. But like, if it was the case that he did nothing wrong, his life has there's been a extraordinarily detrimental incident in his life that'll never leave him, right? So, um, if we acted rashly and there was a national outcry that was not well informed and that was not well thought out, it can have negative effects on innocent people. So, I also want to say that, don't let's understand the power that our words have, and so it's okay to take a minute and think about it and, have an informed response. I do think one thing though is an immediate response that you can have is
Hmm.
the you know the being sad and like mourning with the victims. Like, I
Of
think
course.
that's an immediate response that you can have. But if you're gonna talk beyond that, I think you do need to be very wise about what you're saying and what you're putting out there. Because, like you were saying, even people like me, like, we do have our social circles where, we might have some influence. So everyone is a leader in some aspect. Um, so yeah, but I don't. This is a conversation that I definitely don't want to cut short. So we are past the hour mark, but before we close it out, I want to ask you: was there any aspect of this that you wanted to touch on that we didn't get to hit?
Yeah, I mean, just going off the last question, David. I know I actually I want people to be passionate about things in the world, and let us all be people who are constructively building and prospering and supporting our civil society. Like I want people to be active in that process. But if you have a passion for something, if situations like this cause you to kind of want to step into the kind of social justice arena of things, I would just tell people and encourage people before you step in, um, like whether it's start a movement, start like a sponsorship kind of donation based kind of support system, whether you want to go out and start a nonprofit even, you know, have a clear goal of what you want to do before you start, and let that goal be specific. Like, let's say, just take this case, let's say I want to fight racism in a country, and you're like, I'm going to go start a nonprofit. Well, stopping racism in individuals all across 350 million people, that's just not a realistic goal.
Yeah.
Okay. So, if you want to take that kind of initiative and start something, let's say your angle is police and community relationship. Well, even if you want to do and build something that kind of reinforces and supports and strengthens the relationship between local authorities and the common citizen, like have a very specific goal of what it is that you want to do within that realm even before you start that. I
Mhm.
feel like too many times people get passionate about things without really seeing what the clear picture should be, and then they just go into it, and then it just starts going in directions that it shouldn't go into. Like, I know this is a very offhanded example, but like, let's say you want to end hunger in America. Okay, like, to go out and try to end hunger in America, that's like that's an unrealistic task.
Mhm.
But let's say in just in your city, you look at the data and the statistics, and you find out that there are about, I don't know, somewhere between 5 to 10% of the population that it is truly hungry. living under some poverty line. All right. Well, within even that 5 to 10%, have a specific goal. Let's say in one community, in one city, or in one block of a neighborhood. That's where I'm going to target. Like, and then go from there. Instead of having this kind of nebulous kind of big idea of where I want to go, and then just without having a clear vision of where you want to take it.
Mm.
Now, I say this to say, the reason why I bring this up is there are a lot of very, very good kind of um, groups and organizations that are out there that are trying to ease and work out racial tensions in America.
Mm.
Like, they're big organizations that are trying to do this. But here's a problem with organizations like that. If they don't have a clear goal of specific checklist items that they want to accomplish, they end up falling into this trap of, hey, if there are no sensationalized in mainstream media, like a white cop killing a black guy kind of story out there, they feel like they don't have anything to do. Like their cause is being diminished because it's not being sensationalized.
Mm.
They need something to be sensational in order to be out there, in order to feel like they're doing something productive, when that shouldn't be the case. You shouldn't have to have some sensationalized story, which is real, as we've been talking about the whole time. It's real to George Floyd's family.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you want to help out that cause specifically, then go for it. Like, if you want to help out that family and that community, then go for it. But they're taking it to other levels that benefit their cause without it having to be that way. They don't need to blow it up into a situation that it isn't, and
Mm.
amplify it to a perspective that it needs to get to in order for them to feel like they have a louder voice to do something.
Yeah.
So that's just what I would say is, be passionate about what you're passionate about, your convictions. Think through them carefully, and really weigh out what your values are versus what your morals are and what your principles are, because they're all different.
Mm.
And live with that passion. But when you take action, be specific in your action.
Mm.
Don't just have a general, hey, we're going to go knock down this system that is wrong. As
Right.
you were pointing out earlier, like in police protocol, if that is mandated, then we can take specific legal action against that.
Mm.
But we don't need to set up an organization that wants to bring down police all across the country.
Right.
You see the difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like let's take it specific, so specific things, and deal with one of those things at a time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, that's
that's
great.
where I would, yeah, that's where I would say just use wisdom and be smart.
Yeah, yeah. And to then just kind of tie a bow on this podcast, one thing I want to make clear, very clear to everybody, because I feel like I've said things that can be taken out of context. We mourn with uh, Ahmaud Arbery's family. We mourn with George Floyd's family. Senseless deaths that didn't need to happen. And so
Mhm.
our hearts really cry out for them. Um, but what we were talking about, the criticisms that we were talking about, is using kind of being opportunistically using those situations to further different agendas. For example, people who are just blindly going after police, saying all police officers are corrupt, or blindly going after white people, saying all white people are corrupt. That's counterproductive, and that's kind of the criticism that we were discussing on this podcast. But in the in regards to kind of the Korean American church's response, what I've kind of heard throughout this podcast is that we should definitely show our condolence. We should mourn with them, and we should, show and vocalize how sad we are, and how unfortunate the situation is first and foremost. But it's okay to take a little bit of time to formulate our thoughts and wisely, you know, display, whether it's righteous anger or not, or whatever it may be. Yeah, speak to that in wisdom. But along with that, I wanted to ask you a question. Is it the
Yes.
people of the church that you think should be vocal, or is it just the leaders that you think should be vocal?
For me, it's always been a combination. Um, I mean, even if you're not the leader in the church, you are a member of the church.
Mm,
And your place in that church, in that group, is just as vital and important and revered and honored, just as any pastor or someone in leadership, their position is honored and revered.
mm,
Um, so everyone has a voice. And that's true from scripture as well. Like it's true from what Jesus' sacrifice was meant to be. It's not
mm,
just meant for the head of the family, it's meant for the whole family.
mm,
So every part of the family should speak, and voice those kinds of things. Um, yeah, I mean, it's true that everyone's voice is maybe weighed out and received a little bit differently, but nonetheless, it should be vocalized throughout the spectrum of people, not just the head or just the leader.
mm. That's good. And then our prayer for our community is to for everyone to have wise responses that is vocalized to their community for situations like this. So yeah, guys, I know we talked about a lot of things today, and it's some of the things were kind of dicey, like Pastor John put it. So if you guys have any
Mhm.
thoughts, if you disagree with something that we said, maybe I I really hope that this podcast can incite civil, peaceful, and thoughtful dialogue. So I would love to talk to anybody who might have opposing views or opposing thoughts with anything I might have said, or have other nuances they want to add to kind of what we were talking about. Whatever the case may be, yeah, please feel free to give me some feedback at ihthtpodcast@gmail.com, or on Instagram at I hope to hear this, or on Twitter at ihthtpodcast. And I'm really hoping to keep this dialogue going, because I want it to be normalized within the Korean American church, and that I'm hoping that we can all stay informed with things like these incidences, or let's just call them for what it is, these murders, that we
Mhm.
can stay informed and knowledgeable on, so that we can vocalize our thoughtful responses. So Pastor John, thank you so much for being on with me today. I
My
know
pleasure.
you have 3 kids and you have a very young newborn, so I know dad duties are overwhelming right
No.
now, but thank you for making the
Yeah, to
time.
all the listeners out there, about a half hour ago, if you heard a baby crying in the background, that was my newborn daughter. But I apologize for that. But it's a reality of life. Babies are
Yeah.
gonna cry. So sorry, but not sorry.
No, no, don't be sorry. Don't be sorry. So yeah, again, thank you for being on, and for the listeners, thank you so much for listening, and yeah, let's keep this dialogue going. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.